Welcome to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. This is a podcast about our relationship with food and eating, body image, eating disorder recovery, mental health, and more. I am your host, Lynn Thorstensen, a registered nutrition therapist and body image coach based in the west of Ireland. And I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to season 2 of the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. Can you believe that we've done one season already and that more than 10 weeks have passed since I launched the first quote-unquote proper episode? Because as you might know, I did a few kind of soft starter ones that were made specifically for my Substack newsletter. But here we are anyway, and we're kicking off with one of my first interviews with my Substack friend, Kristi Koeter. And I'm very excited for you to hear this episode. And I suppose what else is coming up in season 2? There is, the pace is going to be a bit slower from now on, and you can expect about 2 episodes per month. I have a handful of very exciting guest interviews that I have done that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you over the coming weeks and months. And there's also going to be some more solo episodes with me where we'll be focusing on looking at different ways we can support our relationship with food, eating, and we might also circle back to body image. What I'm also planning and hoping to do is to put out some more calls for questions from you listeners to have your question answered. And the other thing that isn't really entirely clear yet, but if you are on my newsletter list as a subscriber, you might have seen that I am pondering what my paid community membership offering might look like. And I'm still thinking about it, and we are now in the middle of November, and I think it's most likely won't be launching until the new year. So I'm just kind of putting my feelers out there. What are you looking for? What kind of support in this way would feel manageable? Because I'm also so aware that we get so much information left, right, and center, and I just don't feel like I want to add to it. But what I really would love for us to do is to come together and creating a space where we can have these conversations in a way that feels supportive, nourishing, and that can destigmatize the shame that is often accompanying our struggles with food, eating, and our bodies. So exactly what that's going to look like, I'm not sure. I'm all ears if you have some suggestions, and you can email me in at lynn@straightforwardnutrition.com if you have any suggestions what you think this could look like. But let's get started with season 2, episode 1. So today I'm here with Kristi Koeter, is a marketing and communications leader with 20 years of experience as a journalist, writer, and editor. She is the mother of 2 children who has been diagnosed and treated for eating disorders. She's a co-author of the book Show Your Work and writes the newsletter Almost Sated on Substack, which is where we connected. And her newsletter Almost Sated is about detoxing from diet culture. And when she isn't writing, you'll find her mountain biking, hiking, or spending time with her family in Austin, Texas. So thank you for being here, Kristi. And I am really excited to have a conversation with you. And I'm so happy as well that we've connected on Substack to our newsletter. So welcome.
Thank you. Me too. I'm super excited to chat about this. I know we've had a couple of conversations already, and so it's nice for us to be able to come together and actually have a conversation that we can hopefully share with others.
Yeah, absolutely. So where I really want to take this conversation, Kristi, is your experience as a parent of taking care of your daughters struggling with eating disorders and what that kind of journey has looked like. Because I think
that would be really helpful for people who find themselves in similar situations. Like I work with a few teens. It's not the primary work I do in my practice, but I definitely work with some teens, and obviously the teens have parents. And I think it feels like, at least here in Ireland, that sometimes the support for parents is really lacking as well, and people are left out kind of in the wilderness of, what are they supposed to do, what's happening, how to navigate the situation. So I would love for us to talk about that. And then, as I know, you write in your newsletter, Almost Sated, about your own experience of moving away from diet culture and your own relationship with food. So I would love if we could talk a little bit about that too. So yeah, where would you like to start?
Yeah. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. So I have 3 children, and 2 are daughters, and both of them have been diagnosed with and treated for anorexia. They both were diagnosed when they were 12. So, and both of them spent roughly 4 months in a treatment center here in Austin, in what we call a partial hospitalization program, which I'm sure there's an equivalent in Ireland, but basically it's an intensive program, where they arrive in the morning and they stay till like 8 o'clock at night every day. Okay. So they both did that same program, but the circumstances were very different. I know you hear this all the time where it's like, you've got to adapt for each kid. Every kid is different in treating, eating disorders. And this was definitely the case with my kids. So, for example, with my oldest, she didn't have the same symptoms. I didn't know that she was struggling with anorexia. She didn't have any, there wasn't significant weight loss.
Okay.
But she was severely depressed. And so I started her in therapy and then got her a psychiatrist. And, thank goodness he evaluated her and suggested she might have an eating disorder. And then from there, I got her evaluated by a treatment center, and then she was admitted. And this was long before COVID. So so it was very different back then. I had a totally different experience with my other child, but there wasn't a wait to get into treatment. And so it was just a very different experience. Like, everything was in person. Family education was part of the program, and that was all in person. So it was just a different time, and I'm sure it's still very different now. But with my youngest daughter, starting with symptoms, it was, she rapidly started dropping weight. And since I had already had that experience with my other child, I pretty much knew from the beginning, like, okay, here we go again. Basically, I remembered, like, in some of the education sessions I did, I remember the director of the program explaining, like, if you have one child with an eating disorder, you have a much greater chance of having another child with an eating disorder. So it was always sort of like in the back of my mind that, I needed to be watching for this. And, when it happened, I was just very, immediately thinking, okay, this is a problem and we've got to do something about it. But we were in the middle of COVID. And because of, during COVID, as you know, there's been this massive increase in mental health issues and eating disorders in particular. So it took me 6 months to get her in with an eating disorder specialist, from the point where I started realizing, okay, there's a big problem here. And I really didn't feel like I could do anything until I had that full diagnosis. So I was kind of just watching that situation. I did get her in with her primary care, her pediatrician, and he evaluated her, and his take was, I don't think she has an eating disorder. She's saying all the right things, but I think she's severely depressed. And luckily, because I have already gone through this experience, I just was thinking, nope, that's not what this is. And so, I was pretty prepared. Once we got her in and evaluated, the recommendation was, let's put her into treatment, right? And so, and again, there was a wait for that, and some of the facilities were just doing virtual, which, it's really hard to treat children for eating disorders in a virtual setting. So luckily we didn't have to do that. She ended up going in person in PHP. So just kind of two different experiences there. And then, once my oldest child came out of treatment, she was basically weight restored, and there wasn't this huge struggle. I was just basically following the program in terms of nutrition with her, and which is very rare, and from what I understand and the knowledge I have now, that is a very rare scenario. And my other child's experience was much more typical, where, well, first of all, she left the program not weight restored. And so a lot of that was going to fall on us at home. And it did not work out well for us initially. So, initially she was fine. She came out, she was happy to be out of program. And then she started sliding back into old, habits of restriction. And it just became very clear to us that, if we don't take really aggressive action with this, that we're not gonna treat her, we're not gonna get her the help she needs. And I just didn't want to have her drop all the weight she had gained in program again, right? And so I realized at that point, I need to be much more proactive in this role than I have been, and having to take over, all aspects of meal prep and planning, and watching her with every meal, and following loosely with with the family-based therapy recommendations. And I'm sure you've heard of Eva Muspie's book. She has a book for parents that largely talks about getting your child to eat who doesn't want to eat.
Yeah, I don't know if I've read that book. I've read a couple of books around the FBT approach, and I read How to Nourish Your Child when they have an eating disorder, which is written by two dietitians, I think. It's the plate by plate approach. I don't know if you've heard about that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at that point in time, we were back at sort of a critical, it was, I'm minimizing here. It was a terrible, terrible time. Every meal was a massive battle. Every meal just about ended in screaming and tears and refusal to eat. And it was a really horrible situation. And there was a time, we got into a fight. I was trying to make her eat a snack, and she took, the bar and shoved it into my mouth. and was like, you eat it, and I took a couple of bites, and then she calmed down, and we had this conversation. She was like, it helps me when you eat along with me. And at that point in time, I was still restricting my own food. I'd been engaging in my own battles with food for, my entire life. And I had these internal sort of rules about what I would and wouldn't eat and what time I would eat. And, all along with helping her, I had this little voice in the back of my head that was saying, you need to do this. You need to address your own issues. And I finally realized, there was kind of this turning point where I realized, like, if I really want to help her, I really need to help myself. And just to be clear, I don't think it's not required that parents change their eating habits to help their kids recover from eating disorders. And I do think parents, even with dieting backgrounds, can support their kids, right? I had done that with my first child. But in this case, I really felt like I'm asking her to do things that I am also scared to do. And if, if I really want her to get better, I need to be better. And so, kind of parallel to refeeding her, I started doing research on intuitive eating. And because that had been something that had come up through the nutritionists and treatment that my other daughter had received, is this idea of, like, learning to be in tune with your body. Which I want to preface that, a lot of people with eating disorders may not ever get to that point. So it's not a solution a solution.
Or people who have, other feeding differences or, neurodivergences where more structure is necessary in order for the body to get adequately fed on a regular basis. Like, I feel as well, like when you're talking about intuitive eating or feeding differences, and like, this is where I think personally, like, moving towards somewhere like Substack where you have more space, or towards podcasting where you have some more space for these more nuanced conversations around really complex topics, because we just grab bite-sized information and makes them into these black and white topics. When we're picking it up from social media, I think that's just my own, and that goes for most topics, and not just around feeding and eating, but all kinds of things as well, where we kind of make it into this binary, just like default. If it's not this, it's that, and there's no middle ground, and that's just how it is. But I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I think, again, in this world we live in of comparison and trying to constant self-improvement, you don't want people to feel like, if I can't do that perfectly, I failed at this as well, which is, there's no perfect in recovery.
Right. Well, this is very much the diet mentality, right? You have to follow the diet to a T, or you're a failure. And if you're, and then if you're a failure, and, that for a lot of people just sabotages them, it's this vicious kind of cycle. So, I think there's not a one size fits all approach for recovery from eating disorders. And there's not a perfect way of eating. We're all kind of just finding what works for us through this process, right? But for me, I knew that I needed to transition away from dieting and restriction, because it was this vicious cycle for me. And it was it was this constant kind of narrative running through my mind all the time, this negative, negative self-talk. Basically, I could be the most accomplished person in the world, but because I didn't like my body and I didn't think it, I felt like a failure, and that was ruling me for many, many years. So I kind of just raised the white flag and just said, I surrender. I surrender to myself. I can no longer do this, and I'm going to address my own issues. And so that is basically kind of what happened with me starting this new way of thinking. And since I tend to go all in on everything I do, I started doing the reading and the research. And, I started with the intuitive eating book. And, there was some line in there that was something like, if you've had a lot of trauma in your life, you may not be able to do this without the help of a therapist, or some outside help. And so I found an intuitive eating certified therapist to help me work, through some of my issues, because I'm very, I've had a long history of ignoring my body and a long history of pushing through, pain or ignoring signals. And I have a hard time identifying, what do I need? What do I feel right now? And so I did a lot of work on that as well to help me get through that process, which I think was hugely important for my mental growth, more than, mental well-being, more so than just nutrition.
Yeah. And thank you for that, because I think that is the beauty of like working with somebody else. And also, like, again, I think when we often under realize maybe how much trauma, or how often we're not connecting to our bodies because we're not aware that that's where we are, that it also then you just pick up the book and you read it, and it says like eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full, and it's like, well, how am I going to, I'm not sure I can even feel my feet on the ground, or where my body is sitting, or how it's moving through space, because I'm so disconnected. So it's just like it then, and again then it feels like, well, obviously this isn't for me and I can't do it and I'm broken, and then it just feeds into the same negative self-talk loop that we all really have going on. And I think I feel as well like sometimes that's where the misunderstanding comes, when people, I don't know, maybe haven't read the book or any books alongside around moving away from dieting and reconnecting with your body and moving towards that body trust. They've just seen bite-sized bits on social media and haven't actually either read any of the resources or the books, worked with anybody on it, or like really understand like the deeper kind of bits of, and that this work takes time, it can take a long time, and how it's going to unfold, I think, like you said before, it's going to look slightly different for different people, and that's fine.
Yeah. And that's actually part of why, like, I knew that it would take a long time. I knew that I was looking at years probably to get to this place, because I had had a lifetime of really messed up thinking and messed up body image. And so I knew it would take a long time. And that's part of why when I started, I decided I'm going to journal about this process. And, because my background is in writing, I was immediately thinking, well, I'd like to put out a book about this experience, because there is not that there's a ton there, but there are a handful of kind of books on the subject, but they're not written from the perspective of a person going through the experience and what to expect. And so I felt like that was a missing piece. I wanted to have some examples myself of like, okay, here are 10 people and here are their experiences in the first year, right? And I know that, every person, all 10 of those people would have a different experience, but probably there would be some similar themes.
I would think so.
Yeah. And so that's why I initially started with journaling. And then when I told my therapist, she said, "Oh, you should start a Substack." And and she was
I love that your therapist said that.
She was like, "You can just put it out there and like kind of see, what happens." And so that's what started me with Substack. It's sort of evolved though, because, when I started this process, I thought it was a me problem. I thought I was broken. I was completely messed up, and this was a fault of mine that I am in the body size I'm in, and I need to be fixed, right? And then the further you go in this process, the more you realize, like, actually, no, you're in the body you're supposed to be in. And you listening to your body is, and you may be bigger listening to your body, but that's what your body is meant to be. And it's actually society that's broken. Society is sending this message that you're meant to be this certain size, and society is sending this message that if you just had more willpower, you would be skinny. And so it moved beyond just talking about me, because it's really a much larger issue than an individual problem.
Yeah, I think, and that was also something that I didn't understand, like initially in my own like struggles, because also, I don't know if you've had this experience, but when your eating is like chaotic, or you're dieting, or unless you're dieting with a friend or friends, but you're in that cycle, and then it feels like there's so much shame around it. It's a really isolating experience in and of itself. And then when you maybe eventually like reach out for help and stuff, it's like you're working with your therapist or your nutrition professional or coach. And then it's like, and even in the early resources that I read when I first sort of moved this path professionally, there wasn't that many of them talking about the cultural connection and the cultural issues, and like diet culture as a whole. And then like when you widen it out into the bigger systemic issues like patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, all the isms, ableism, racism, how they're all kind of feed into this. And even when we say, oh, but I just want to lose weight for myself, or I just want to fix my nose for myself because I want to feel better about myself. It's not about what anybody else thinks, but like, where did we get the idea that we have to fix our bodies to look a certain way? Like, we didn't come out thinking like that, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree.
Even when we say it's just for me. Really? Like, if we lived somewhere where there was no mirrors and nobody had ever heard of diet culture, and like, you didn't really know what your body looked like to other people, like would we really care what it looked like? We might have other issues, but like that might be one of them.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I think there was a study done. Have you come across this one? Is it in Hawaii, or could be in Fiji or somewhere like that, where they didn't have TV commercials and they didn't have any particular high prevalence of eating disorders or body image stuff. And then when they were getting more access to that kind of TV and commercial and information, it sort of all of a sudden things were increasing, because it just wasn't a focus in the culture on Western beauty ideals, as opposed to and we are more influenced than we think we are, and each generation have their own source of influences and how we think about bodies. Where are you now on your journey, Kristi? And what would you, from where you are now, what would you like to go back and tell your younger self?
Oh, that's a good question. A really good question. Well, if I could wave this magic wand and go back, I would try to eliminate all of that negativity, in terms of messaging, because I remember being a kid and thinking I was fat, and I look back now, my sister just shared a video of us as kids, which was very rare to have that, we were in high school or whatever, but I'm like, you know what? I've always been broad and I've always been very muscular, but I was not fat. In my entire life, I thought I was fat. And so I think that if I could go back and just eliminate those feelings, I wouldn't have, obviously I wouldn't have gone through this full life of thinking I'm a failure, and that, just the negativity around that one aspect of your failure because of your body size has influenced most of my life decisions, because if you're constantly in this negative self-talk, it's just like you're pulling yourself down. So that's where, I wish where I could get to, and I think one of the beautiful things about my children having gone through the experience that they have is that they're very quick to recognize diet culture. They're very quick to understand this is not okay, and this is, negative self-talk or body shaming, or, at least now they have the education to see what's happening. And I think it will positively influence them for the rest of their lives. But in terms of where I am with my journey right now, I'm going to be real. I'm struggling. I think I've gone through a place, it's been a year of transition, a year of not dieting. And I've had, a variety of, breakthroughs, I think, in terms of, understanding how detrimental diet culture is and all this, the cycle, and how it, makes people feel horrible about themselves. But where I'm fully on board with this idea of listening to my body and, nourishing my body and seeing food as this beautiful thing that helps me live. But because I have gained weight and I'm a very active person, it's hard at times because I have physical restrictions that weren't there before. And so that has been super challenging, and I'm trying to work through, how do I address these issues without dieting, which is really a hard thing, and I'm also wrestling things with thoughts like, should I lose weight just so I can physically be able to do what I want to do with my life? Is that okay? And I don't see any way that possible to make that work.
Yeah. because it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not
Well,
maintainable.
it doesn't work, and I don't want to go back to that feeling, where all of my thoughts are occupied by food and restricting food and what I should be doing. I just don't want to go back to that.
Yeah. And it's like that both and where you are now, and in terms of where your body changed and how those changes impact your life are also real, and things that I hear people grappling with over time, in my own practice, and it's like, on how do you balance that particular when you've gotten to the place of knowing that I cannot diet anymore, or even working actively on not doing that, and healing that relationship with food. And then it's like, and here's my body now that has changed and it's not working or behaving the way it did when it was slightly smaller. And what am I going to do with all the feelings that this is bringing up? Because it's like, it's kind of like, I was going to say you can't have the cake and eat it too, but that feels like the wrong analogy in this example. It is just really hard and difficult, and I think that it is hard doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong, or that anybody who's experienced something similar to what you're experiencing mean that they're doing it any wrong. I feel like I don't know if you come across Body Image with Bree. She's a woman. She's a social worker on Instagram, and she's in a large body. I think she had weight loss surgery when she was quite young as well. And she talks a lot about body grief and around that, like, how do we move towards that space of holding ourselves and our realities with acceptance.
Yeah.
And within that, and I think that goes for any kind of body changes, whether they're as a result of dieting or not dieting, or ability, disability changes that happen in our lives and how our bodies are functioning, that sometimes we might have to spend some time grieving the changes and aging being part of them too. Because I don't know, I'm in my early 40s. I'm just noticing that I feel like my body is behaving a little bit different to what it has been.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just feels like there's a different energy when you're moving into your 40s than, say, my 30s. I don't know. This is just my personal observation.
No, I mean, I think that's part of this whole thing, is accepting that our bodies are meant to change is a huge, huge part of the journey, and grieving the former body, or the former body you were chasing,
Yeah.
A lot of us never achieved what we wanted, but we need to grieve the ideal that we were chasing after. I think I've done quite a bit of that work, but I also think that part of this is, as you know, that recovery is not this linear process. And I go through periods where I'm struggling with particular issues. And I will just give this as an example because, I just returned from vacation in Hawaii. And the first part of the vacation, we were in this very tourist, kind of probably upper middle class environment. And I got into this really bad, like, comparison situation and felt like, oh my gosh, I see no one here who looks like me. And I got into this really negative headspace about it. And then we moved to a different part of the island, and it was like, there are real people here and real more representation of society here. And I calmed down, and I realized, because I never really thought of, I had heard this, but I didn't really realize, like, representation matters. seeing all sizes, you know, is important in part of this process. And just, you know, and then I ended up, you know, my oldest daughter and I were on the beach and talking about it. And she said, yeah, I was feeling really bad about myself. And I'm a very small mid-size, you know, so you know, she was even feeling it, even though arguably it's one of those things, right?
Yeah. And I think that's why, you know, for each one of us, like dismantling diet culture, like personally, internally, but also then like working collectively of undoing all of this stuff and like not doing our best not to even inadvertently uphold it, serves everyone.
Yeah.
But of course it is, you know, it helps people in the biggest bodies the most. Like that's the kind of, but it does, because even people in smaller bodies or small bodies are still feeling the same. Though for people on the outside, it's like, yeah, well, what's your problem? Like, and don't face the same, obviously not the discrimination as people in much bigger bodies, but it's just the narrative is still simmering in the air, and you know it does affect everyone though very differently. So we'll all benefit, I think, from working towards that, so that the next generation of young people come along and don't have as a greater risk of developing disordered eating or eating disorders.
Yeah. I mean, the more we can destigmatize, you know, weight and larger bodies, I think the better for society as a whole. Like you just said, I mean, it seems like it's so simple, this idea of just stop stigmatizing, you know, people in larger bodies. That would end so much of the issue, right? But you know, how do you stop?
It seems so incredibly simple. It's like, just treat everybody as decent human beings, you know, respect and care and access and accommodations. And how difficult can it be? But because there's so much of that stereotyping and biases woven into like everything all the time, everywhere, whether we've internalized it or not. And even if we haven't internalized it, we've probably internalized the messages about what we should think about people in larger bodies. And so either we make that about ourselves, or we're afraid that, you know, if our bodies are changing, then that means that you like all of the stuff that just fits into that. So, but yeah, I mean, for me personally, the solution, you know, just treat people with respect and care, and as human beings. Like, how difficult can it be? But I think there's the health narrative then that kind of fits into, that makes this a little bit more complex than maybe it has to be, but it does make it a bit more. And the idea as well, I think, around weight, the fact that the message that is being portrayed and sold, because, you know, as you know, this is a huge multi-billion-dollar industry, and there's a lot of people in different areas making a lot of money of trying to change bodies, regardless whether it's work or it doesn't work. But the fact that we're led to believe that we have control over how they behave, or what's they're fat or small or tall or short or whatever, that it's like, if we could eventually arrive at a place where natural body diversity is a thing, and let's help people take care of the bodies they have, maybe there would be a lot of people out of business if we arrive there. you know,
for sure. I mean, I think the danger we've got right now is, you know, one of the biggest problems is the weight bias in the medical community. And, we've gotten to this point where people think obesity is a disease in and of itself, and it's so hard to argue with people on that point, right? And then you have this, billion-dollar diet industry that's pushing that narrative, and especially, the drug makers influencing the medical community through it is systemic, and it gets down to, it makes it much more complicated because you've got all these parents who they just want to do the right thing, right? They just want their kids to be healthy, and they're looking to the medical community to tell them what's healthy. And the medical community has this, baked in set of biases that, it's just extraordinarily hard to fight against that.
Yeah, I don't have kids myself, so I can only imagine, and I can't even imagine what it would be like as a parent of a child in a bigger body having an eating disorder. It's almost like for a lot of medical people in the medical professional world, right across the spectrum, it's like, unless you know or understand that people in bigger bodies can have restrictive eating disorders, and not everybody with a restrictive eating disorder will lose a significant amount of weight, or there could be a significant amount of weight lost, but that might still keep the person, depending on the starting point, within a quote unquote healthy, and I say inverted commas because of BMI is bullshit anyway, but that's kind of, so then you're in this, oh, that's great. Even though the person might be displaying all the symptoms of a restrictive eating disorder, behaviors and mental and physical as well. So it's like, oh.
Yeah. I feel so, I feel so lucky because I just happen to get the right treatment for the right facility for my children, because I know there are a lot of facilities out there that are still inadvertently keeping children, especially, trapped in eating disorders because of their own, there's bias there as well. And depending on, if you're trying to keep a child in a normal BMI range and setting a target weight range that doesn't fit for that child, you're effectively keeping them in a restrictive state, right? And they, a starved brain is not going to recover.
Yeah. And that's where the physiology meets the psychology in that brain space of and prolonged starvation. And then in Ireland, like there isn't an awful lot of access for help, and people are often have to get quite sick before they get help. And it's, as well as like the longer you wait, the harder it gets, and the recovery, the chances of full recovery are much higher the earlier you can put in the interventions. So that's just, and then when people are older, once you kind of moved out of the camps, it's much harder again unless you have access to private care, because you'd be waiting a long time. And then even if you do get access, you might get some bit of support, but you might get access to a psychiatrist, but you don't have a nutrition professional to support you with eating or making sure that there's adequate nutrition, or it's like, so it's just, it's quite difficult. And the people that I have met through my practice, particularly with restrictive eating disorders, who relapsed, unless they were or had maybe maintained somewhat, but then relapsed further, unless you had private insurance, which not everybody has here, it was virtually impossible to get like inpatient treatment unless you end up in the psych ward, which is not necessarily ideal either, because that's not going to give you the treatments that you need for your refeeding or your eating disorder. So yeah, it's really challenging, and it's not. And I think, and then the weight bias added to that just doesn't help. There was another question I had, Kristi, which just really circles back to the beginning of our conversations, but I was really curious, when you were doing some of the refeeding at home with your daughter after the PHP, what kind of support did you get as parents around trying to make that very difficult process happen?
Well, not very much. Not very much, but I will say that, with my first child, I was a single parent and freshly divorced. So I felt like I was going through that experience very much alone. The second time around, I have since married, and I have a incredibly supportive spouse. And basically, he got on board, with the program. And here's the thing is that this refeeding and recovery, it requires the entire family to be part of that process, and so I did feel supported in the sense that he was on board with it. There are a lot of families, I listen in on these support sessions, and there are a lot of families that you have like one person is not, the father is not on board or doesn't understand, and so there's this kind of inadvertent sabotage that happens with the process. We were very lucky to not have that, but it was challenging in the sense that while I was refeeding, I was trying to, I added a lot of cream and a lot of butter to every, oil, cream, butter, every bit of fat I could get into especially the dinner, because that was the meal that my daughter would eat the best. And so I wanted to make sure I was like sneaking all of that in. And so, at a certain point in time, the family's like, are we having this again? I'm like, yes, we are. Everybody get on board. We're here, but in terms of outside support, I don't really feel like, I was seeing a therapist, but it was mostly for my own eating issues. So I didn't have a ton of support in that regard, but I did have, we have a good team in place for my daughter, and I would meet with regularly with her nutritionist, and she would be kind of a support for me. And we did, we tag teamed on here's the approach, and this is what we're going to do, and how we're going to we were together, united, and that helped in terms of getting my daughter on board. So there was support from that perspective, which was a big benefit.
Yeah, I think it's good to know for people and what that process can look like, and yeah, how you manage through. And they're both doing well today, you said.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think as well, like the fact that you said they are so aware of diet culture and they can spot it, feels like relapse prevention from where I'm sitting. It's like, yeah, that's really going to help them be awake enough that they don't sort of just inadvertently just fall into like, I'll just try a little diet and see, just for whatever, even if it's like in the future for their wedding or losing, getting their body back after having a baby, or, all the typical kind of diets that people might do who never even thought about it before. But I think when people are have had an eating disorder like that, you're even more, you know, that you're very susceptible to that your body, that this is how your body responds to restriction.
Yeah. I mean, that to me that's the thing that scares me the most, is now just knowing how susceptible to relapse, my children are, even if they, had a cold and didn't eat for a few days and dropped to a certain level, that could start triggering a lot of these physiological responses again. So I do think there's this kind of, as a parent, I've got this kind of constant like vigilance around, that probably will never go away. Maybe it'll go away, but it's sort of always there in the back of my mind, like just making sure, where are we here, and, but I think that's just
you're their mother, so of course you're going to care, and you went through that process with them as well, and knowing that it's not like something that I'm guessing any of you would want to repeat anytime soon,
right?
But I think knowing that there is that susceptibility there, just might be really helpful, because I feel like some people that I've talked to and met, particular older generations, that when people didn't really know what an eating disorder was, or that this was this could happen. I'm thinking about one person in particular. I think she was in the early 60s and had an eating disorder in her teens, kind of recovered sufficiently, went on, had a life, and then when she hit menopause, she gained a bit of weight, decided she was going to quote unquote do something about it, and then that transpired into a full hospitalization relapse. Like, there wasn't too much to begin with, but it was just that just set her off then on a path, because that was where her body was at. And I think even when I met with her, not sure, was there enough still awareness that actually this is how my body responds when, if it goes below a certain point, this is where I end up. We don't know why that is, why it happens like that for some people. I think they're not clear, because for most of us, when we get to a certain point, or we haven't eaten enough over a certain time period, when the food becomes available, we'll binge eat, and that's more like a natural response to restriction, because that's really conducive for survival, whereas like eating becoming increasingly more difficult isn't really conducive to survival, like from a species point of view, right? And some people's brains and bodies just respond that way, and I suppose you don't know until you know, and at that point it's really hard.
This is what I think about. There's so many people that never fully recover. When you read about adults who had eating disorders as a kid and they never fully got out of it, so they stay in this perpetual cycle, and then the risk of a heart attack is so high. And I mean, you have a lifetime of kind of this restrictive behavior, and then just tragedy happens. It feels to me like, the more aggressive people can be in treating eating disorders, the better, versus letting this cycle continue for years and years and years. I
think so too. And I think if people were getting more support earlier on, including with the refeeding, and this is just me from observations, but then like also without the weight bias, and just keep pushing through until like the behaviors essentially have gone away, and wherever the body stabilizes at that point. And simultaneously, I think working towards unlearning all the societal internalized stuff has to happen as well, regardless of the person's body size.
Right.
And it's like, is this the eating disorders? Is this societal? Is that yours? Are they yours? Like, do you want to, so, and it is hard. Like, I work with a mix of people with different eating issues, but I do know with like some of my restrictive clients, like it's a very long, slow, sloggy road of, keep at it. And where I've also seen that, like when things are improving and then weight might drop inadvertently because of sickness and stuff, and then all of a sudden the behaviors might just intensify again. But just like to keep pushing it in. Some of my clients have been like younger adults, they didn't want the parental support in the feeding, which makes it hard. I personally think that makes the road longer that they've been taking, because it's been slower to increase the food intake over time than if you had been a bit more aggressive to begin with. But because they're adults, they have more autonomy in that sense. And, I'm in private practice. I only take on people who are medically stable, but that's not to say that they are weight restored when they arrive, right? But it's just much slower. And I'm thinking like, well, if this had been more aggressive from the start, with the support of family and people making meals and sitting down and eating and making it happen and not feeling like they have to do most of it on their own, it would have been quicker, I think. But that's kind of, trying to figure things out. And it's a little bit different. And in this country, there's not a lot of support for people, like to get more intense support, unless you can like pay for it, basically. Which is unfortunate as well. So, Kristi, this has been really great. I think lots of different directions. And I want us to kind of wrap up with one of my favorite questions that I ask all my guests. And that is, what do joyful nourishment mean to you?
Yeah. So joyful nourishment to me feels like finding joy in what you eat and savoring the experience of eating, like truly enjoying your food because you love the taste of it, but also because there's an appreciation for this food is life sustaining, and I think giving thanks for what you have. Too many people turn the act of eating into this shameful bad thing, but I think we should be savoring food for what it is and what it does for our bodies.
Thank you. That's beautiful. It's the life-sustaining gift that it is. Yeah, I love that. So where can people find you, Kristi, if they want to sign up to a newsletter? And I put any links in the show notes.
Yeah, so I would say Substack. At my Substack is called Almost Sated, and it is its own domain, so www.almostsated.com. That would be the primary place that I would send people to.
Perfect. And I love the title of your newsletter too, Almost Sated. I think it's a great name. It's a great name. There's lots in that. There's a lot for me anyway. When I hear that, there's just a lot in that. So thank you so much, and I hope there's been loads of takeaways for people who are listening from this conversation.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for listening. The Joyful Nourishment Podcast is produced with no financial backing, and your support means a lot to keep this project going. If this episode has been helpful in any way, please consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. This helps the podcast to be found by others. And of course, you can also forward this episode to a friend whom you think may benefit. Find out more about what I offer on straightforwardnutrition.com. And if you're interested in working with me, please use the link in the show notes to book in for a free initial 30-minute session. And finally, please come and join the Joyful Nourishment community over on Substack, unless you're there already, by subscribing to my newsletter using the link below.